Customs Glitter channel, and today I've got another video for you as part of our beginner series. So please like the video and make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you never miss new content. All right, let's get started. Okay, so today I'm going to teach you how to apply your glitter using the epoxy method. There are a lot of different ways to apply your glitter, and I really suggest learning all of the basics, all of the foundations. Get that down, get those under your belt, so that when you learn more complicated designs, you're gonna have those foundations down. It's gonna be easier to pick up those designs. Some of those techniques might require a combination of these foundations, might work better with one over the other. So whereas I generally use the epoxy method to apply my glitter, that's my favorite. I feel like it gives it a better coverage. My glitter lays flatter. I have to switch it up sometimes when I'm doing a different design, and you know, that's the way of the art. So learn them all, okay, and get them all under your belt. That it's going to benefit you in the end. I've got my cup prepped and ready to go. So I've given it a light sand, I've washed it, and I base coated it close to the glitter color that I'm going to use today. Today we're going to use Wintergreen. This is gorgeous. It's one of my all-time favorite colors. I use this glitter a lot. And then I've got 15 milliliters of epoxy mixed up and ready to go. That's 7.5 milliliters of part A and 7.5 milliliters of part B. A lot of times in these videos when we're talking about epoxy, it's the total amount. It's the two parts combined. We'll specify if it's not. So you always just kind of want to keep that in mind. And there are some bubbles in here, and I'm really not worried about that right now, okay? We're definitely not going to use all of this 15 milliliters to coat and use this as an adhesive. We're using it as an adhesive. Blah, I'm getting tongue-tied over that. But that's what we're doing. We're not trying to give it a nice smooth coat over glitter or anything like that. We want this a really, really thin coat. So a lot of the times I'll have a couple of cups ready to go, so I'm not wasting any of this epoxy, or I have like a silicone mold set off to the side so I can, you know, pour a little of my glitter in there, pop it in a mold, and again, I'm not wasting any epoxy. It is very important that your epoxy is mixed 50-50 ratio. So it's harder for me to mix any smaller than 15 milliliters and get a really good 50-50 ratio. If your ratio is off, then your epoxy probably won't cure properly. You might not be able to tell if it's only off just a smidge, but the more that epoxy margin is off the 50-50 ratio, then you're gonna have, the more troubles you're gonna have with your epoxy. So it's really important to get it 50-50. So I've got my epoxy, and we really just want, again, I'm gonna move my glitter to the side here, just a little bit. So I'm gonna pour just a smidge and start working it around. You don't want this dripping off in any type of way. That is a lot of people's problem when they first start using the epoxy method to apply their glitter. That was my problem when I first started using this method, just using way too much epoxy. You really don't need much at all. And just work it around and make sure you're completely covered. My cup's moving up here. I'm gonna shimmy it off my arm. And then at this point, I'm a dipper on a lot of things, so I just kind of dip my finger in just a bit to get a little bit more. I tend to get less when I dip. But whatever works for you. So make sure we got a good coat all the way up to my rim, because I'm going right up to the top. Some people will tape, and that's okay. That again is personal preference. And I'm not worried about the bubbles at this point. Remember, this is such a thin coat. There really is not a whole lot of space for the bubbles to be. They've kind of popped themselves. And as long as you are smooth all the way around, it should be good. Some people use their torch at this point. I don't really feel that it's necessary, so I don't. It's a thin layer, and I don't want it to get too hot. If it gets too hot, then it can get kind of wonky, kind of like almost fisheye looking. So I should have had this on a different arm. It keeps wobbling up, but that's all right. Okay, so we're nice and coated. Now again, I usually have my glitter in a shaker, but this is a brand new 1 ounce jar, and I really wanted to show you how far this is gonna go. So I've got a blank piece of paper just to catch my glitter. And this is the first time I'm opening this jar, so it might be a little messy. It's really packed in there, guys, I'm telling you. Such a good deal. It's so worth the price. All right. And I kind of work in sections. I tend to go bottom to top on a full glitter tumbler. That's just the way I do things. No right or wrong. You can go top from bottom, middle out, whatever you feel. So we're just gonna kind of start shaking it on there. Make sure you're nice and well coated. Now let's see if I can get a light. I'm very heavy handed. So I want to get a light sprinkle up here to kind of show you guys something. Hopefully it'll show up well enough on camera for you. But if you have some spots that kind of look a little wet looking compared to other areas, see, this is very well coated, this is not, because the epoxy is still coming through that glitter. Then if you see those like wet looking spots, it really just means you need to add more glitter in those areas. So once you've got your tumbler fully coated and you start seeing some of those wet spots up here, it's just the glitter sinking into the epoxy. Dump this back in my jar here. And again, I'm very, very heavy-handed, so that's why I really like a shaker, so I don't have to dump back into my jar so many times. And look, it's so full, I can't even put the rest of this in there right now. I gotta get some more of it on my cup. Just make sure we're really good. See the sparkle of wintergreen? Now another reason why we base coat these cups is if this was over a white base, it wouldn't be quite this bright. And this is because this is a translucent glitter. So a lot of your lighter colors really, really want a good base coat of something. I do like to put it over white sometimes and give it kind of a more muted look and just do the one coat. It's really fun to kind of play with the base colors against the glitter color over top of it. You can come up with some really cool effects. All right, let's make sure, I'm gonna watch this go around here. Make sure I don't have any of those wet looking spots, any areas I think might need a little bit more glitter. And kind of focus on my rim. I feel pretty well coated here. I'm gonna give it a little tap, get any of this excess off. And with a shaker, it's a little bit easier to kind of shake it onto the bottom. But with this jar, it's a little harder. I don't want to make a mess. So a lot of the times I do like to take my arm off and then shake on my bottom, kind of turn it up so I can see it a little bit better. That way I know I'm coated well on my bottom too. You can do this before you even put it on the cup. Give it another pat, and there we go. So I can actually go put this on my drying rack and reuse this turner and put something else on it. I don't need to leave this cup on my turner. This should be such a thin amount of epoxy, and it is so well coated with this glitter that there should be no movement. If you turn this upside down and put it on a drying rack and you get a bump, kind of like a little muffin top around the top where it's slid down, then you've used too much epoxy on that first layer. So it might take a little bit of a learning curve to really realize how little bit of an amount that you've used. I mean, this was 15 milliliters and it's just under. I mean, it's such a small amount gone. It's really hard to even measure how much came out of there. So again, very, very, very little. Put this on the drying rack, and it's gonna take probably about 6 hours to dry. Now you're gonna have to play with your epoxy and kind of get to know it a little bit. Different environments, it's gonna act a little bit different. So here in Ohio, my humidity might be different, my temperature might be different. It might take me an hour less or an hour more for my epoxy to dry than where it does in your area. So one thing that I did when I started really learning my epoxy is I set that little medicine cup right to the side of the cup that I had just done. So that way I'm not tempted to touch this cup and potentially mess it up. I can use a popsicle stick or glove finger, and I can kind of touch the epoxy in that medicine cup, and I know if it's tacky, if it's dry, you know, can I go to the next step or can I touch my cup yet? So good thing. And then once you know your time, you don't need to do that anymore, you know? So something to just kind of help you gauge when that first layer is dry. And it's harder because, you know, you've got the glitter on top of it. So even if you feel it, it's hard to tell whether it's fully dry. So leave that medicine cup on the side. We're gonna let this dry and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so our epoxy underneath the glitter is dry and we're ready to move on to the next step. So the first thing I'm gonna do, I've got my paper that I used earlier here, and I'm gonna take a paintbrush. I like these fan ones, that's just personal preference. Any clean, dry paintbrush will work though. And we're going to dry brush our glitter off. And this just removes all of the excess glitter. Number one, stretches your glitter just that much further. And you really just don't want all that glitter just moving around. So just get it all off. And at this point, we really don't need to seal this because it's one color. If I had multiple colors of glitter on here, I would probably seal it. But one solid color sealing before your first layer of epoxy is not necessary. Okay, so I've got all my excess glitter off. I'm gonna put it back into our jar here. And look at that. I mean, it still looks like we've got a completely full jar of glitter here. So you can do so many cups, especially if you are only doing half a cup, if you're doing like ombres. I mean, this glitter stretches so far. All right, let's get our first layer of epoxy on. So I've got my epoxy ready. This is 30 milliliters total, so 15 milliliters of part A and 15 milliliters of part B. I might not use all of this, but I rather have a little bit extra so I've got room to work and I'm not trying to mix some up midway through. And if I have any extra when I'm done with this cup, again, I'm just gonna toss another layer onto my silicone mold. So I'm gonna pour just a little bit. I don't want to pour too much at once and not be able to kind of spread it around because I don't want it just like dripping off and wasting my epoxy. So So it's kind of in sections for me. And again, you'll kind of get your own rhythm of how you like to apply it and what works best for you. Just be careful, because you really, again, if it's just dripping off, it's not doing anything but being wasted. And you will have some drips, and that's okay. And again, my epoxy in my medicine cup here, it's got quite a bit of bubbles, but I'm fine with that. I've got my torch, and it comes off pretty easy with a torch. Now this first layer of epoxy, you're gonna need a little extra epoxy than you would for any of your other finishing coats. And that's because some of that epoxy soaks up into this glitter. And that's all right, that's just part of the process. So on this first coat, you will need more epoxy. You're gonna hear a lot of people talking about a flood coat. And in a way, I guess this is a flood coat for me, because I'm using more than I normally would, and I'm a little bit like flooding the area with epoxy. But I don't want it super, super thick. I prefer to do thinner coats. I get a better end result that way. My cup, the center of this cup is level. My turner is level, my arm is level, but it's a curved cup. So if I get too much epoxy, then it's gonna kind of drip down, and I'm gonna get a saggy bottom down here at the bottom, and that's not what we want. So for me, thinner coats is best. And again, that's gonna be kind of personal preference and what works best for you. But try these thinner coats and kind of work your way up to see where that limit is. I do not want to walk away with this cup dripping epoxy off of it. And I've seen a lot of people do that with their flood coats, and it's just not the best way, because even though that epoxy is dripping, in time, if not enough of it drips off, when you walk away, you can kind of get like one little area that has kind of a little bit of a ridge, or kind of see where it tried to drop a little bit, but it started to get hardened and it was curing. So you just don't always get the perfect finish that way. I do kind of just like to check my tops and go over like this. That's how I kind of make sure I'm not getting a saggy top. Same with the bottom. Make sure your bottom's covered. And you just want to make sure that you are even all the way around. I like to use my finger. Some people use like silicone makeup brushes. Whatever is your personal preference. Again, you're going to find I say that probably too much, but it really is the truth. A lot of this, just have to find what you like best. And I think we're really good covered here. Now the last step is a torch. You want a really good torch. This is going to help pop any of those air bubbles. Now you just want to do quick passes back and forth. Do not leave it in one area too long. If you start getting it too hot, as long as you're moving it, it's going to give you a little bit of a warning. It's going to start to smoke before it actually catches fire. Pay attention. Pay attention to these signals. Use your eyes, use your ears, use your smell. You know, all these important things, they are all very important, because the epoxy, once it gets too hot, it does kind of give off a little bit of an odor sometimes. So you just want to be careful when you're using heat with all of these products, and just be very, very careful. I suggest having some type of a fire extinguisher really close in your craft room, just for safety. So again, if you had it in one area and were just like torching it, it probably won't give you much of a signal before it just up in flames. But I don't want the torch to intimidate you. I just want you to be careful. So just keep those things in mind. So this is gonna spin, and I'm gonna leave this curing a little bit longer than I did the first step where I just used it as my adhesive. It's a little bit thicker and it's gonna need just a little bit extra time before I'm able to touch it and move on to the next step. So on average, this one's gonna be probably about 8 to 10 hours before I move to the next step. So I'm gonna let it spin and let it cure and we'll move on. Okay, so this has been curing for a good 10 to 12 hours actually now. It is nice and dry, I can touch it, and this is actually really pretty smooth. Now, if I would have used a craft glitter, there's probably no way that this first coat would have been smooth enough for a decal. Also, if I had used a chunky glitter, then with my thin coats of epoxy, I'd probably need one more coat of epoxy before I move on to my decal stage. Even with this fine glitter that I've used with my thin coats, again, sometimes I need that second coat of epoxy. So just feel it, make sure it's smooth, and as long as it's really smooth, then you are good to go. Decal this, do one more coat of epoxy, and you should be fine. Now, if you find your rims are a little bit rough or your bottoms are a little bit rough, at this point, it's only one coat of epoxy. And again, it's a thin coat of epoxy that I've used. I'm not going to do any sanding on this whatsoever. I do not want to sand if any bit of glitter is exposed, because I can take the sparkle off of it, I can dull it, and I can take that color out of it. So I really don't want to do that at this point. Now, with the fine glitters, I usually, once I do my decal right now and do one more coat, I'm usually great. I don't need any sanding at all. But sometimes you do need that sanding. So a higher sanding block like this is a 120. This is more of a smoother sand. So this would be really great if I apply my decal right now and do one more coat of epoxy. If I feel any roughness, I'm going to use this smoothing sanding block and kind of smooth out my bottom, smooth out my rim, and do one more coat of epoxy to kind of shine it all back up and bring it together. So decals, use your Cricut, Silhouette, whatever you have, water slides. There's so many different options for decals. So the only thing that you really want to make sure is that, again, this is smooth. If you put any type of a decal over a bumpy glitter, that's going to show through to your end result. So yay, we have learned how to use the epoxy method to apply our glitter to a tumbler, and I hope this has helped you all. Make sure that you like the video and please subscribe to the channel so that you never miss new content. And I'll see y'all next time.